Dave, it's been a long time, hasn't it?
It has 10 years,
At
more or
least.
less.
Let's say 10, but I think it's even been just a bit more than that. You were actually, I think the statement is true. I've done the job long enough now. You were part of the early cohorts of students that I had when I was still trying to figure out my own footing as a professor. And yeah, so now I've done this long enough, like I can actually have podcast chats with former students and talk about like a pretty long story about what's happened since. So Dave, I mean, just for everyone watching or listening, because it's been 10 plus years and we haven't had any sort of preamble or catching up in between, I guess the most appropriate thing I could ask you is how things been and what have you been up to?
Gosh, when you reached out, Brian, and first of all, happy to be here. I feel like stepping into this, it's a couple of war buddies coming in together, After all these years together, you of course being the captain or the colonel of the squad, and I'm one of the foot soldiers coming in. It feels like I've lived many lifetimes, Brian, ever since graduating 10 years ago, and I guess even you saying, "Hey, you were early stage in your career." Of course, it didn't appear that way because when I had met you, I my mentality was very much in the thick of it, and I think in many ways, even though we're so far removed from it now, there's still so much to be in the thick of it about. So. I realize I'm answering your question with a very vague thought cloud, but
To be fair,
that's the best way I can describe it.
I asked you a big question, and then I guess there are many ways to answer it. One is like, oh, here's the chronological list of things that I did in bullet point form. That'd be the resume answer, right? You
Yes.
obviously chose not to do that, and actually tried to describe like how you would summarize the journey. You're building the suspense, though. I'm talking to you now. Are you in London, like the real London?
I was in the real London, yes, and only someone who's lived in Canada would know to ask whether or not it's the real London or London, Ontario, where we met. But I was there for a year and a half, and now I'm actually in Barcelona. So have not like updated my information, so apologies for that. But this is part of the ongoing journey.
Wow. Let's just start wherever you want to start. Last time we chatted, you were in Toronto.
Yes.
Um, And I think I could have pretty easily predicted you would have made some kind of change in the next couple of years since our last chat, which I suspect you did. You obviously did to get to where you are. Um, I would be very curious, kind of what was. Let's start there, right? So you graduated from Ivy. You got your first job in Toronto, and you can comment about whether it was what you wanted, what you didn't want, whether it was a learning experience to kind of help you learn what you really wanted, which is often the case for the first job, and kind of what the set of pivots were, decisions that you made that led to where you are now. And obviously, I'd love to hear about Barcelona, but why don't we start kind of how you got there?
All right. I will try and do this in the condensed resume format, but exactly how you said it. I think every experience leading up to now has been what you stated as the latter, a learning experience, for good or for bad. There's been no regrets whatsoever. Starting a job in Toronto working in consulting, which was the original field I wanted to step into, and it was very exciting at the time. I think very quickly as a young 20-something-year-old, you learn what's advertised and what you're stepping into isn't actually what the job becomes. And very quickly, now that I'm so many years removed, I think within weeks of starting that job, this is back in 2015 in late summer, I knew it wasn't for me. Um, and I think even stepping further back, this isn't helping my chronological storytelling. Stepping into business was also and going to Ivy because it was a 2-year program, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about this. Was also sort of a cry for help because I didn't know my path at the time, and there, looking back, there were so many decisions I could have made, should have made, would have made, but I was none the wiser at the time. But yet, I stuck in that job for 3 years, learned a lot, learned about, I think, a lot of the dynamics of working in the business world, learning to communicate, collaborate, um, learning the aspect of having responsibility and accountability for my work, which, of course, back in school, it didn't necessarily matter if you didn't show up for class, you didn't study for an exam or whatever it might be. It was just on you. But now you were accountable to the success of, in consulting at least, your team, your clients, your company, of course. And I I will be honest that I within that path, I tried to find outs that were within, let's say, the realm of knowledge of what, let's say, consulting exits into. I wrote my GMAT. I thought about going back to school and actually applied to some schools in the States. I thought about applying to tech, big tech, because it was booming at the time and trying to get into operations, which was more along the lines of strategy and in my kind of perfect world, what I would have hoped my original consulting job would have been. But ultimately, I think what led me down this very long journey of deviating away from the norms of, let's call it, the Canadian North American dream, was taking the difficult decision just to quit. Um, and at the time, already actually not financially stable by any means, still was carrying student debt. I took the choice to step back because I felt as though I didn't have the perspective to move forward. Swung the complete opposite way. This is kind of moving chronologically forward. Became a fitness trainer, a wellness type of person, because it was actually in my ethos and something I had given up when I had stepped in and started Ivey, a few years back at this point. Tried to do that full time for many reasons, realized, again, I can't do this full time. Joined a startup through a series of coincidences, was doing both at the same time. And then because COVID hit, I think now I'm going to try and fast forward here so we can start a bit of a dialogue. Made a difficult decision to step back from the fitness because doing it virtually just didn't give the same fulfillment, but started traveling just as a means of finding more purpose. And I think through a 6-year journey, a few startups, a few breaks, a bit of freelancing, it's made my way around the world. And here I am now in Barcelona.
Wow, and that is still, I can tell, very much the summarized, condensed version. So especially for people who kind of are going to listen to only the audio version of this, the moment you said fitness trainer, my eyes just popped because this was not where I thought you were going to kind of go to at the pivot. So I definitely would love to hear. Okay, let's start filling in some of the blanks. So
Yes.
I have this image in my head. You are at that point, is it 24 or 25? So 3 years after graduation, you're sitting there. You already knew within weeks that wasn't what you wanted to do. So it was really just a question of, so what do I do now, right? So now that here is not the answer, right? So, okay, you're nodding your head. So
I'm
feel
nodding my
free to
head.
fill in if there's more to it than that you want to.
I don't think that despite not knowing it was for me, I necessarily chose to start looking for exits right away because, to your point, I was quite early in my career and in age. I felt as though there were opportunities to learn, opportunities to prove myself wrong. And truthfully, I think across myself, the circle of connections I have through Ivy, for example, who were also kind of going through this um, coming of age experience, let's say, in the workplace. I think there was a big motif around grit and being able to stick it out, and also this kind of shared experience between myself and my connections with not having alignment at work and bonding over that trauma per se. And it felt as though that whole container or atmosphere kept me in that job for a very long time, and allowed me to continue to develop my skills and my experience and understanding of what consulting and let's say the corporate world, quote unquote, really is.
Okay, so, which presumably has some value, but let's get to that. We can evaluate that later once we've fully understood the story of you, Dave, and kind of what's happening, or as fully as we can on a short podcast. So, okay, so even though it's wrong, it doesn't mean that you're leaving right away. You're kind of sticking it out. There's this concept called grit, because you're right, at that time, that's been kicked around a lot, right? Seen as a huge virtuous thing. That's an interesting one because I have such mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, yes, it's something that you want to cultivate as a life skill. On the other hand, if you're just doing something you hate and all the signals are red, and you're saying, I'm going to stay here because of grit, this is where I really start to think it starts going the other way, right? About whether that's a good thing to follow. The irony is that when that's taught, right, or when that's presented, it seems to be regardless, right, of the circumstance, right? Like grit is going to have this great value, and I think I definitely know some people who I would say have tremendous grit, but I don't know if there's much point to it at a certain point, like where they're at. They're much older than you are, Dave, to be fair, right? So they're like in their 40s and 50s, and I'm like, man, you've hated it the whole way through. I'm not sure why you're doing it.
I mean, I personally have a few hypotheses. I'm fully aligned with what you're saying. If I can only translate it to my time, which of course is quite anecdotal, I think the environment where we met of Ivy really pushes you into these streams and leads you to believe success is a linear path and that you need to stay on the ladder, you need to hang on to dear life, and you need to climb to find a fulfillment with a sense of purpose. Because let's be honest, right? We spend so much of our lives at work, so much of our identity, at least in North America, is tied to work. Well, if you can't convince yourself that there's success in that, I can imagine there's a big dissonance and a sense of, for lack of a better term, shame about who you are, that we can't find fulfillment in something that we spend so much time doing.
Yeah, or I guess I'll say this from my perspective. People struggle to find fulfillment in something that they were lied to would be fulfilling for them, right? Which I think is a much more accurate, right? I mean, and we'll talk about this later, but a question I will ask you later, Dave, is kind of the positives and negatives of how you think Ivy shaped you, right? And for people who are listening that are not familiar with Ivy, for example, people south of the border, I mean, to Americans listening, I would say Ivy is very much like Wharton undergrad, right? A very similar, very competitive, very elite, very clear messaging about values, right? And what's valued. And I think you're articulating, just like, probably everybody in that age range who walks into a place like that, that's competitive and wants to, sort of find their path. It's not shocking that you would have kept going for a while, right? Until you basically got to a point where like, no, right? Like I just can't do this anymore. Not in the sense that like you can't do it. Of course you can do it, but from a sole purpose standpoint, call it whatever you want. Like I'm tired of buying this when it's clearly not true for me, or in your case, maybe for you. And you're nodding your head through all this. So I guess I'm barking up the right tree here. So, okay, so let's fast forward. So you're spending several years not being happy, and then you get to a point where like, all right, I'm done. And you said quit. What led you, so going into fitness training immediately afterwards, I get that this would be in some sense continuing something that you had started before Ivy. So in some sense it sounds logical. But in the narrative that you're telling me about developing those corporate skills and all this kind of stuff, it doesn't exactly sound like necessarily the next move that would have built off that. And I'm kind of curious what was going through your mind at that point.
Yeah, I think the years of working in consulting as well took me further and further away from myself and what brings me joy. So I think by extension of that, Ivy as well, which of course we'll speak about. For example, my health was not great at the time, to say the least. And what I shared earlier around this shared trauma, a lot of it was around, hey, let's go out on the weekend and quote unquote drink our sorrows away, you know? And after years of doing that and doing that in Toronto, where the scene or the city really isn't that big, it starts to wear itself off quite a bit. And I think in the same way that being part of business school makes you quite homogenous or samey, um, that lifestyle made us that as well. And I think I wanted to carve a different path and create an identity for myself that is unique. And whether that's my ego speaking because I still hold on to that now, or truthfully, it gives me, true internal intrinsic motivation. That's where the fitness side came in. And I think to your earlier question around, not being the next logical path, I would challenge that because I think just like how the business world can be quite homogenous, the fitness world was that as well. And I think what at least where I found success was that people who trained with me, my clients, or my approach felt different to them. And that was feedback that I was receiving. I was more personable or the way I wanted to go about my business felt more structured. And, I don't want to go down the world of the business of fitness too far, but that's where a lot of fitness professionals struggle. They want to open up their own practice and have their own autonomy, but they don't necessarily have the business know-how or the social aspect of things to be able to take them to that next step. And I felt as though I was able to break that barrier straight away, coming from somewhere that's entirely free of the pressures that someone who starts their entire career in the fitness world comes in with.
Okay. Okay, yeah, all right, I take your point. So you actually come in potentially with some skills and advantages because of that training and that background, which makes sense, right? If I think about the different trainers I've had throughout my life, I'm not sure that they've necessarily all had that. So you come in and you're kind of going down this road. How long do you do this, Dave? How long are you doing the training thing?
Yeah, from a full-time perspective, where I was trying to build my brand, um, only about 8 months officially, but working alongside this while being in a startup, I did this for a year and a half in addition to the 8 months.
Okay.
So let's call it 2 years with change.
Okay. So what you're essentially doing, am I right? You're kind of splitting your time and your focus between building your own kind of personal training business, I think, right, is what you've just articulated. And then also working at a startup. What were you doing at the startup? What was the startup about?
Yeah, this startup was in HR tech in terms of employee experience, which I was doing HR consulting before I should have specified. So there were transferable elements within it, but um, many of people who are listening here who are trying to jump from a corporate role into a startup role may relate to this, but I was one of the first hires in customer success. And again, that comes down to the project management skills, the higher level thinking, the stakeholder management side of things that it was able to bring in. And it was a fairly early stage company. It actually stayed bootstrapped through its entire life cycle. And I was employee number six. So it was quite early. And yes, I was splitting my time. And I will plug that this period of my life, I felt the most aligned in terms of my career. And I was putting in a lot of work, oftentimes working at the startup throughout the day, going straight to training in the evening. But what was very interesting is despite the hours I was putting in, which were probably equivalent, if not more, than when I was doing consulting or what I'm doing now in just pure play in the startup world, um, it felt as though I was using two different muscles in my body. There was the mental load sitting at the desk, um, putting on my best face, and then there was the other side where I was able to exert physical energy and let go of the steam, so to speak. And things felt really good, especially when I was doing this in person prior to COVID times where everything went virtual.
Okay. And is it fair to say that so COVID comes along and obviously disrupts this, right? Probably both your startup experience,
Yes.
because I'm sure the startup did not adequately plan for a pandemic and what that would do, and obviously if you're in the fitness industry, you're going to get disrupted by something like COVID, particularly up in Canada, right? Because you guys had very long lockdowns, which then forces a different, right, just a very different kind of situation. Now,
Absolutely.
did COVID cause the shift that was going to come after this, or did it simply accelerate in retrospect now that you can look back at it? Or do you think it simply accelerated what was probably already going to happen anyway? It just happened way faster.
No, I definitely think it forced my hand in terms of making some hard choices because, as I said, I felt more aligned in my career sphere of my life. And while I'm taking this alternate path because startups at the time were still quite alternative, um, and not relating so much to my peers anymore who were kind of moving up the corporate ladder and choosing to, settle down, buy homes, etc. That truthfully I felt less interested in and less aligned to. I was about to take the same path prior to COVID. I thought about, financing a car. I thought about getting a dog. That would really help me lay roots and create stability in Canada. And it was only because of the pandemic that it forced me to really evaluate how I fit within this way of living, and the people around me.
Oh, I see. Okay, but Dave, I'm going to push on it just one more notch, and then you can tell me,
Yeah,
no, Brian,
please.
this is really what I thought. Let's say COVID had not happened. Let's say you'd gotten a dog. Let's say you had kept going. Do you think you eventually would have gotten to the point anyway where you're like, you know what, this just isn't just not working, right? And then you still might have ended up taking off for something else.
I think it would be hard to say. I
Yeah.
would like to think no, simply because prior to COVID and prior to starting to travel, I was really never exposed to anything outside of Canada. Because of my consulting experience, for example, I traveled very, very sparsely because the travel from work was already tiring or the hours from work were already tiring. So I had taken, let's say, between the years of when I graduated to after my graduation trip to COVID, when I started traveling away, maybe 2 trips in total.
Mm.
So in a 5 year period, or more or less. So it wasn't top of mind. And again, it was about finding a sense of balance, community, sense of self. So therefore, I think if this knowledge had never been imparted in me, I would have never made a different decision.
Interesting. Okay, so in your case, the pandemic really was a life-changing event in the real sense, right? Not in the sense of a delay or anything even, which it did for many others, um, but actually your whole path ended up going in a completely different direction. Okay, so
Yes.
COVID happens, life goes upside down. It does for everyone, but in your case, it's not going back, right? So what happens next? And is this the part where you're now getting on a plane for Europe?
I mean, Europe comes a few years later.
Okay.
But I think, the first year of the pandemic with the lockdowns, I stayed in Canada and um, these were creating my doubts. I think it wasn't only until the second round of lockdowns that were about to kick in where I made the difficult decision to leave. And as someone who's never traveled quite far and actually under the influence of a now close friend I met, Mexico came to mind because of the proximity back to Canada in case, let's say, things don't work out. And also because of the more relaxing restrictions and frankly just the weather because it was going to teeter into the Canadian winter again. So that's where I chose to go. And prior to that, again, had never been to Mexico. Actually, never even enjoyed Mexican food at that point. Spoke zero Spanish, but it was fully taking the plunge. And I think to your point, Brian, where I'm always grateful because I had the ability to choose and to take that brave first steps, whereas a lot of folks, for one reason or another, for family, for financial reasons or what have you, were forced to stay in Canada. And I think potentially where you're about to go is by separating myself from that environment, I grew in a different path as opposed to my peers and even my close friends, which made my social relationships or just the general relatability and perspectives in life differ. And then subsequently, every time I came back to Canada, I felt less connected to the people I was very close to prior to the pandemic.
That's an interesting perspective. Dave, do you think, this is just me talking out loud here, do you think that actually a similar version of that story, but just to kind of refine it, is that rather than the pandemic actually making you into a different person, that you actually already were, but you didn't know it, and you were slowly figuring that out? The reason why I'm asking it this way is because you were saying even prior to, even without the pandemic, right? Prior to this, you were already seeing your peers taking paths that you already had this feeling were just not going to be what you wanted, right? Which is already a sign of difference. Now, this is important because a place like Ivey or that type of environment really reinforces that that's the path, right? So you have very strong incentives to not deviate, right? Given that kind of your training takes you down that road. So
Absolutely.
I do kind of wonder whether the narrative is that, Dave, maybe you were different to begin with and you're learning about your differences as opposed to this made me different.
I think absolutely, and we spoke a little earlier about folks who stay in their roles until they're late in their life and never enjoying it. And this is part of the gratitude that I have is that I was able to make a choice that allowed me to realize that, because the choice is not offered to many. And I do think a lot of us who go through business school, Ivy, or otherwise and step into this world and climb the ladder, perhaps they don't actually want to do it as well. And they're not given the choice or not given the ability to realize that there is a different path to choose.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think we're in agreement on that. So you go down to Mexico. I mean, I still remember the lockdowns. I was even in Canada for part of those lockdowns, and my goodness, they were long, and the Canadian winter did not help, right? So I completely
Yes.
understand. So you're down in Mexico. Are you working at that point? Or are you just figuring it out as you go? Like, did you have something set up down there?
No, like I said, it was my first time, and I was just going to just try and experience how it is. I think the popular term on the streets these days is digital nomadism, and I was definitely part of that movement. Our startup had gone remote, and I think to your point, the dynamics really changed in terms of the way we worked, because before we were hybrid in office, and now we were just virtual. And I think it just created an environment where, truthfully, I just translated how I lived in Canada to the best of my ability into somewhere else where there was sun, and of course it was in a culture I was not as familiar with, and then tried to take learnings along the way around how people lived, as well as new hobbies, things to eat at a minimum, and just that kind of cultural aspect of it.
Um, and how was that experience, by the way? So it's your first time. It's got to be at least a little bit sort of, I don't know if intimidating is the right word, but maybe a little bit uncomfortable because you're not used to it. Um, was it everything you hoped for and more, or were you like, oh gosh, what am I doing? Like, what am I doing here?
Um, I think, and I will still feel to this day, even as I travel to new places, having done it for so many years, you always think when you land, why am I here? Why did I leave the last place? Why have I made this decision? But that feeling quickly goes away once you find your sense of stability. And I think for everyone it's different. For me, let's say it's having a cafe that I can work at, a nice, comfortable one with not a lot of noise, great Wi-Fi, air conditioning, whatever you may have, a nice gym, a sporting activity like being able to play soccer, football, or go rock climbing or play beach volleyball. And then a community of friends. I think those things allowed me to ground actually very quickly. But perhaps what was daunting about that experience was just how different, of course, especially in the framework of the pandemic, where Canada and Mexico were polar opposites in terms of how they were managing the situation, where I had stepped out of full lockdown, no going outside, even also because of the winter time, to everybody's just living life laissez-faire as is. That took a little bit of adjustment, and that was a bit of a shock. And more importantly, I couldn't share that with my connections back home because they were suffering through the pandemic. I didn't want to tell them that I was potentially living this great life because, I didn't want to create worry.
Yeah, I totally get that.
Comparison.
Yeah, well, everyone. I mean, so the Canadian winter is not something necessarily to be, at least for me, something to be enjoyed that much anyway. But you throw a pandemic on top of that, that makes it so for you to be, if you were posting photos on Instagram of your, drinking coconuts on the beach kind of thing, I could see why that might be upsetting, perhaps for some people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And over the years, I had to learn it the hard way that over time, it's just not worth talking or speaking about the experiences that I'm living elsewhere because there is unfortunately just very little relatability between the connections back home who are living this one version of life and then me the other, pandemic or no pandemic.
I,
Um,
I get that, particularly given the context that we've just talked about. Did you find that the people you met down in Mexico were people that you could relate to pretty well, actually? Like you guys kind of understood each other and sort of could have these kinds of conversations?
Absolutely. I think we were here for all the same reasons, especially the expats or the nomads or the travelers. They were here to because of the pandemic escape from their circumstance. So we were all very grateful for the freedom and the community we were able to form that perhaps we couldn't have back home. And in that time, I think uh, if you ask anyone who was nomadic during that time, they would say it was very special because unlike now, where it's very easy to just hop on a plane and go into the next place, there were a lot of requirements to leave the place you were to go to the next place, and there was stable community, which is often a criticism or a struggle that nomads have is just the lack of continuity between the connections they make, and something that I struggled with myself actually coming out of the pandemic and continuing to be a traveler.
Yeah, no, I can see that. But there's something really nice about your story so far, Dave, and obviously, we haven't even made it to Europe yet, right? But
Yes.
you graduate Ivy. Even when you're in Ivy, there are question marks about, where do I fit in? All this very classic kind of questions, right? So there's nothing, in some sense, there's nothing unusual about that. You try the path that's been laid out for you and dictated to you. It's not really working. You pivot. The pandemic comes, and basically the messaging there is, no, you're not doing that, right? And again, you're forced to adapt. And then in the middle of the pandemic, when everybody's miserable, you're down in Mexico and you're finding a group of people that actually you have connection with. I mean, I'm going to try to word this as precisely as I can. So the people that you met down in Mexico, did you find that you guys could understand each other more than maybe when you were in consulting? Like if there was someone next to you that was kind of easier to relate to kind of down in Mexico? Or did you find that that's not the right way to evaluate it? There's just a difference there.
There's definitely a difference where I think various times we had quite a big group at the time who again couldn't move elsewhere, which was again a very privileged position to be in, where I thought these people that I'm speaking to, spending time with, living shared experiences with, I would never speak to them if I was living back in Toronto because we are so used to being surrounded by people who are similar to us. Especially in Toronto, I wouldn't know for other cities in North America, but um, and I think when we talk about again, this where there were happy times and there were times of misalignment, meeting these folks, some of whom are not working whatsoever, some of whom are retired early, some of whom have actually very interesting careers that, in the spirit of going to business school, Ivy, who are streaming you to very specific streams you've not thought of before. And in comparison, where I'm working in a startup where the demands are increasing because of the COVID environment and working virtually, it makes me feel a little more honestly resentful towards my work identity because I'm thinking I have to put so many hours um and and this and that into my work whereas other folks are able to enjoy their lives. And I think this is the beginning of how the cultural side opens me up to, hey, perhaps this way of working, this way of living in Canada is not the way that everybody else in the world does it. So, um, but
Yeah.
that spiral is what actually drives me all the way here to Europe.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's impossible to explain to someone and expect them to understand what that is. You have to take someone out of their environment and put them somewhere else, and then have them live it essentially, and then it's like, oh, yeah, I don't know if I can go back. Right? It's so interesting how life works that way.
Yeah, and I will put a plug that it is very challenging for North Americans to have this kind of experience because, on one hand, geographically, North America is very far away from most places. But then on the other hand, our work structures, lack of paid time off, only 2, 3 weeks a year, let's say, means that with the time off, you're not going to go root yourself in and experience a culture, at least not at that time. You're going on a luxury holiday just to decompress before resetting for the quote unquote grind.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Okay, so on some level, you're obviously kind of aware of all this while you were having your adventures down in Mexico, working at the startup. Where does the transition to Europe happen? Or is that jumping ahead too much, or is that the next logical part of the story?
It's a fair transition point. After Mexico, there was always a plan to go back to Canada. Going back to Canada, spending the summer there again made me feel even more far away, further apart from my peers, which then led to an exploration in Europe simply because some of my connections that I met in Mexico were from Europe and they were telling me to go visit them. And that led me onto a journey where, again, you see an entirely different way of living. You learn about what Europeans think, care, and live their lives in a way. And it creates yet another perspective in your mind around, what is my ideal life, my ideal place? Because I do think, and again, this is a common theme amongst nomads, is there is a form of escapism from where you were coming from, whether functionally, psychologically, spiritually, whatever you may have. But we all want to find a place where we belong, whether it's a group of people or it's a place. And I think towards this time was where I was thinking, okay, these are really cool places. I don't necessarily want to live in a suitcase all the time. Where can I find a place where I feel connected to? And around this time was around the time when my founders, my company, instead of choosing to raise the Series A, actually just had an offer they couldn't refuse to sell the business. And we had already grown for about 3 years together, and I felt as though, okay, I'm lucky to be part of a startup that's actually going through a transaction where I'm going to receive a benefit. I'm going to take some time away and actually find a way to carve a life in Europe. Um, I'll pause there, and because that sort of serves as a transition point as
Yeah.
well.
Oh, very cool. Okay. This is a great story, at least so far as you're telling it, right? I feel like I need to get popcorn and listen to kind of how this, at least so far, like the bigger question, of course, if this was a movie, like what happens next, where's the climax and where's it end? But none of that stuff has happened yet. I, so you start off kind of as one of many, right, in the Ivy, let's call it the Ivy system, but that's only because that's a school that's common between us. It refers to kind of something much broader, of course. And what I feel like I'm hearing from you is an evaluation of the lifestyle and the values of at least the culture and society that you and I know really well. Let's call it B school culture, right? It's of course bigger than
Yes.
Ivy. And you already knew before this that in its strictest form and with its greatest values wasn't going to be your set of values. Like they just didn't line up, even if you tried to force yourself. And so you've now kind of had your trip to Mexico, you've had a different experience, and you've learned that there's actually different values and a different community, which is the really important thing, right? Because
Right.
even if you have different values, I see other people kind of struggle with this. even if you already know that your values don't match that of the collective that you know, like your society, your group, your school, if you don't know another group where you would be welcome, it's still frightening as anything else, right? Like enough to be paralyzing, right? And so I definitely see lots of people who end up in that type of paralysis. In your case, it seems like not that you had paralysis or fear, but just that exposure in Mexico was enough, plus kind of a little bit of luck with the startup selling, bought you a runway to take yet another risk, right? If the first one was Mexico, the second one is, well, now I'm just going to go to Europe just because I have some friends there, right? Is that basically correct?
I would say so, and even stepping a little bit further back, I would like to think, and I hope that I'm one of the few who takes the risk of quitting a stable, well-paying, and growth-oriented consulting gig, just to kind of find a perspective. Because again, there is a value towards stability in this world, and like you said, there's a lot of paralysis when trying to move away. So people move to things that are similar. In North America, especially, the transition from one job to another is as few as 2 weeks. So oftentimes people go from one ladder to another. And perhaps the next ladder is also, again, something that they may not fit in. But having done that and stepped off the ladder entirely, I think that opened me up to taking a lot more risk and trying to pursue that path.
Is it something that you would recommend to, let's say, like there's a 24-year-old version that reminds you of you, right? Version of you is what I mean to say, right? And and in this world and calls you up and says, I am so miserable right now. Like I don't line up with all this stuff. And it's a story that you know well, right? Because it's the one that you walked through. Would you feel comfortable recommending to them to quit and to do take your path? Or do you think it's actually not that simple?
I well, what's funny, Brian, is I see research around the future of work, which is a topic I'm connected to, and generationally, those in the Gen Z category are doing this quite often. They rather than the values that were necessarily imparted from us, from let's say our parents around, accumulating wealth, stability, trying to retire early, it's for the current generations getting lived experience. So they're doing this without me asking. I think extrapolating what you say to someone who's perhaps not 24, but maybe 34, um, I used to be a lot more liberal in terms of recommending this, but I realized through my own trials and tribulations that this life definitely isn't for everyone. Um, and that there are folks who just despite potentially not being aligned to the way they were living, find benefits within it that if you were to take that away, probably in the longer run outweigh the what they're getting or what they're losing.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think, Dave, that knowing yourself, obviously being older now, as well as you do, that you could have potentially taken that other path and found a way to be happy, or are you of the mind that you know what, there was no way that was going to work?
It's I I contemplate the what ifs, the dream machine of if I took this path or that. First of all, I don't think I put too much stock in it because I do think the world changes faster. The dynamics of work and life change faster than we can even expect. Because of course now I work in a different startup and it's a very different working circumstance than my previous one. Um, so I don't think that it would have been never that I could have never done this, but I just couldn't imagine the type of person I would be. Because if I go back much further and think about the values that, let's say, my parents instilled in me, it wasn't necessarily to go be the best of the best. They actually craved normacy. They wanted me to work a 9 to 5 job that was very close to home and that by 25 have a home and 2 kids. Um, and I do think there could have been a world where I was this, telling a bit of a personal story. I went to university on my own dime because my parents wanted me to stay home. And if I was going away, they said, you finance yourself. So there was a world where I could have chosen the safer option and commuted to school in Toronto And I could have come out as that person who lived close to home and perhaps found a partner. And that was that. Um, but to answer your question, that's not a never, but now I cannot imagine that version of myself.
Okay. I mean, here's why I'm asking, right? So there's one could propose a theory that from the day you're born, there is something called a true self, right? And so what your mission is in life, as an argument, would be to find out who that true self is and then to go out into the world and do what aligns with that true self, right?
Right.
Could, the version of you that, didn't go off to Ivy and stayed near Toronto or in Toronto, right, for school and followed that path, still have lined up with the true self, assuming that the current version of you actually is much closer, right, to that true self? And my initial gut reaction would be probably not, right? I mean, and I think partly why I would say that, but Dave, tell me if I've got this wrong, is because when you graduated from Ivy, that actually is the road you were kind of on to begin with, right? You weren't on this road, you were on that road, and there wasn't anything that you told me that makes me think that, oh yeah, he's going the right way, right, at that point, right, in terms of how that goes. I only have that, right, to kind of potentially take as a signal, but feel free to tell me I'm wrong or that I'm not thinking about that right.
Yeah, I'll give an example. Prior to Ivy, I was just doing I did a few odd jobs here and there in the summer. One of which was working at a winery local. One of which was working in the YMCA, the fitness center. And it was very cool to be in that experience. It's still one of my favorite jobs to date because everybody knew me and I was part of a community and things were predictable and easy. And I think there is a lot of truth to ignorance is bliss, where had I not stepped out of that path, I wouldn't have known any better. And perhaps that creates happiness for me because I do think that when you take simplicity away from life and we're exposed to all the luxuries as well as the challenges, that creates the need to climb and to find something different. And I think challenging your theory there, that the true self, it would be a bit of a sad way to think because, again, you and I both know folks who maybe are far enough in their career and still don't find that alignment. If you get to the end of that career and you think, oh, what was that worth living for? Well, then that's just regret. I like to think of it more as a tree where your true self is perhaps the big tree trunk in the middle, and there's all these branches that come out, and no matter which way you go, it still connects back to your true self, which is the trunk. It's just a different branch that you've stepped on, but you can't go back. The branches don't merge. You can't go back and go
Mm,
forward into a different branch. I know this is a bit of an odd analogy, but
I see. So
perhaps it paints
you
a
pick a
picture of how I
path,
think.
you can't pick the other paths, but there's something still authentic about it. Am I getting that right in the analogy you're saying? Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and if let's say you tomorrow I move back to Canada and I try to build a life there, it's not like I'm going back in the tree and going to a different path because I'm a different version of myself now. I'm moving forward and creating a different branch. And that me at 30 something year old will enjoy Canada differently or see Canada differently than me at 21 coming out of school and choosing that path.
Yeah. It's an interesting idea, right? Like neither idea or neither version of the story is provable in some sense. So it's sort of just what you believe. Um, Dave, if I'm still running this podcast in 10 plus years, I'm going to ask this question again because I'm going to wonder whether you still think the same way, right? But I totally get why you think this and where you're coming from with it. I do understand this. So now you're leaving Mexico for Europe. Um, at this point, are you sort of showing up without a job again? Because you've got some startup cash out money, I think, right? So you can survive for a while.
Yeah, I took the year off and I between paying my debts and doing traveling, kind of burned through that. I was looking for work in Europe, and unfortunately, at the time, my mom got ill, so I had to take a step back and go to Canada. And I think by then, again, the remote working environment had changed a lot. A lot of companies pushing employees to go back to office. And even within remote categories, which I think is changing again, you were only allowed to work within a specific geography. So while I was looking for work in London, the companies that I found weren't giving me the flexibility to, let's say, be in Canada and take care of my mom as needed. So actually, rather than jumping out 2 feet out, I ended up now, which by the way, in between, I did a bit of freelancing just to kind of learn more about what's out there in the world. Um, I joined a Canadian, what is now a scale up, um, just to be able to have that flexibility. They were letting me work remotely and a very different world because it's in healthcare tech, but still related to recognition for private home caregivers. So there are still adjacencies to my previous role. So since then, I'm still at this scale up now. Um, I've lived in two different cultures, two different time zones. Um, so I have my life in Europe, but I have my work identity in Canada. So I still have one foot in both camps.
Oh, I see. This double life situation. I honestly, I think this is becoming way more common, right? And you alluded to this before. I think this is, I won't say it will ever become truly normal, but it is becoming way more mainstream and less strange as time goes by. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the pandemic, for all its unfortunate outcomes, opened the perspectives and the opportunities that people can hire across geographies and work together
Yeah.
virtually. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. So, so you got a job. So you're working for a Canadian employer, but you were living in it was London, and
It
now
was London, yes.
okay, and now
Now in Spain.
Barcelona. And that's just because you felt like it, or was there a particular? Did something pull you to Barcelona? I guess is really what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, so in trying to find that place, what I mentioned when I was traveling, I think London was very much it. It had all the things I needed for my personal life. And at the time, or even now, actually, I got into a romantic relationship with a partner. She was from Europe, and we met traveling, which for a lot of digital nomads is sort of dream state, like meeting
Yeah,
someone while traveling and actually like willing to make the compromises to travel with each other. And she came with me to London, and we lived there. But because of, let's say, financial challenges and climate challenges in London, because it's not easy to live as someone who's not working locally and making Britain pounds sterling. Um, it was hard to kind of create an ideal life there. So she is actually a tax resident of Spain. Again, this speaks to the whole kind of globally placed workforce and corporate setups. So it made sense for us to come to a Spanish city. And during my travels in Europe, I did travel Spain for a few months, and Barcelona was a place, probably the only city I found in Spain that I would personally live in for my own personal needs.
yeah. I have. So I've never been to Barcelona in particular, but what I have heard from others who have lived for some time in Spain who aren't Spanish and other people who visit, they all say the same thing about Barcelona. It's apparently a fantastic place.
Yeah, but for anyone who follows the news, it's not without challenges. Now living here, I hear a lot about the social challenges that exists here and the unfortunate anti-tourist movements that are happening as a result of some of the infrastructure that's been put in. So there's no perfect place in the world. That's another takeaway from traveling, but here we are.
Yeah, but you it sounds like you're pretty happy there. Am I correct in kind of thinking this that Barcelona versus potentially coming back to Toronto as a place, right? Obviously, you'd have things pulling you back potentially, but if you just had a place in the world you were going to want to land, at least at the moment, Barcelona.
Yeah, yeah. And the unfortunate thing, and this just comes down to me, what I care about and my life philosophy, the more places I visited, the less and less I felt Canada was the place for me. So I would, every place I felt like, oh, here was Toronto, and here's the new place I went to, and the new place leapfrogs Toronto as a place I was willing to live. And the Londons of the world came up at the top of that list.
Oh, interesting. So I have some guesses as to why that is, and I think you may have even alluded to some of this before, but why? Dave. I mean, so Toronto's where you're born and raised, right? Like you're very much native Canadian. So why, as you're traveling to these places, are you finding that you find them more appealing than home in some sense?
Yeah. So first of all, I was born in Hong Kong, but I came to Canada quite early. But this makes me still a first generation immigrant. I think growing up in that culture, so first of all, my parents had a set of values they instilled on me back from Asia. I grew up in Canada with a set of values, but then again, when it came to work identity, I am someone, for better or for worse, that subscribes more to hedonism than stoicism. And it felt as though, whether because of cost of living or because of what was prioritized in Canada, like that was not necessarily available to me. Um, and I I couldn't I couldn't continue to see myself misaligned now, knowing that there were places in the world where I would be able to live more aligned to myself.
And by this, you mean just that you would be able to enjoy life more, right, in these locations? Whether it's because they're cheaper or because a cultural environment that's different, is that?
Yeah, or even at the very least, it's the social interactions you have and the things that you talk about and care about.
Hmm.
Um, Canada didn't necessarily feel like that for me anymore.
Interesting. Um, are you comfortable kind of talking about what those like? What are you talking about over there in Europe that's not being talked about in Canada, or vice versa, right? Like, what is the nature of the conversation that's different?
Sure. I'll answer your question by just citing examples in sort of work-life balance and culture, right? I think there's this long-running anecdote that, in North America you live to work and in Europe there's work to live. So there's that piece that stands very strongly for starters. I think they're increasingly, especially as we get older and we prioritize our time, there is a lack of spontaneity in Canada, uh, where I found, at least in my circles, where, hey, if let's say I ring you up, Brian, and I say, hey, let's get a beer. You're telling me I have an opening in 3 weeks out. I'm going to send you a calendar invite, and it will be maybe one beer. And then at the time, it may or may not happen because I don't know, other things have come up, you know? Um, and I miss that because, especially thinking back to university, those are the most enjoyable moments that I think all of us cling on to, the community and the spontaneity of doing this and that in the evening or during the daytime. Um, I wanted to experience more of that, definitely. And I felt as though the structured living environment in Canada and the priorities that exist didn't necessarily enable that.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, it definitely sounds like you're talking about just value differences, right? So,
Exactly.
so in North
Cultural value.
America, we absolutely put work above, many of us at least put work above everything else, right? Regardless of what we might say. If you just look at how we spend our time. And then you're right. If you've got to schedule someone in and then it's invites, whereas maybe you're in Barcelona, it's like, hey, you want to get a beer? And they're like, yeah. And then you guys have a 3 hour long chat and you just laugh about stuff spontaneously. Yeah, I can see why one might find the other more appealing, right? As a lifestyle.
Yeah, and of course, with regards to, life over work, geographically, being in Europe means I can easily get on a flight for pennies on the dollar and go somewhere for a weekend. And that becomes quite normal. Whereas, again, going back to, because of, let's say, pay time off policies in North America, it's a big hoopla to go on a trip somewhere. And um, it it kind of takes away from, you know, experiencing different cultures and enjoying oneself as a sort of big experience, big life moment versus something that can come more frequently and more accessibly.
Yeah. Dave, I think I already know the answer to this question. It actually might be obvious from even your narrative, but I just want to ask this. When you were younger, right? But let's say even last time we talked, right, 10 plus years ago, did you have even the faintest idea you would be where you are now? Because sometimes people
Yeah.
say, particularly in these podcasts, like, "Oh, I knew this since 22. I was going to end up here." I didn't think you were going to say that because there's nothing about your path that would suggest that. But did you even have an intuition that it might happen, or were you just like, "Wow, I have no idea how this happened"?
No, I think if I rewind myself to the 2015 version of myself when we were speaking, the goal was at this time in my life, I'd be working in private equity with an MBA, um, ideally a penthouse apartment in the city, you know, living with the luxuries that I need. And never in my wildest dreams have I ever guessed that this would be the path that I've been set on.
Yeah, yeah, and living where you're living now. Um, so putting this all in context, Dave, looking back, now is probably the right moment for me to ask you, what are your thoughts about your experience at Ivy, or let's just call it the B school experience more generally? What what do you like looking back about your experience? What really don't you like and wish would have been different? We can just start there, right?
Yeah. So for anybody who's listening who's not familiar with the Ivy program, first of all, it's not Ivy League. I get that asked that a lot, which is why I refer it to the business program at Western University, they call it now. It's a 2-year program, so you go in to, let's say you're doing your first 2 years at Western, you can study whatever you like, and then you go into this business program, which is very, very accelerated. And I've heard since I've graduated, even more accelerated in terms of what you learn, the opportunities that are present to you, etc. Um, it's funny, Brian, because every time I think back to Ivy, I always think about how misaligned I was and how I was perhaps not the greatest version of myself because I was streamed into this rat race, for lack of a better term, that there were 4 verticals at the time: consulting, marketing, accounting, finance, and that you needed to chase these things. And that you learned over time that some people do have head starts ahead of you because they were able to access the curriculum beforehand or get some deep business knowledge because of perhaps their family or connections that put them further ahead. Um, and that it pushed me to be this version of myself that competes for something, not on my own terms, which made it very challenging. And I think ultimately, again, I'm starting with all the negatives because they're more top of mind and easier to grasp. Is that a lot of the skills that were taught or the curriculum that's taught, and I think this translates as well into MBA, as I've heard from many friends of mine, that you don't actually learn these technical business skills. Going into an accounting class wouldn't teach me how to be a good accountant, for example. And I think when you come out of work, there's a massive sticker shock because on one hand, what's been promised to you from a career perspective is never what it really is, right? Because work is work, and you learn this a very hard way. And that actually the most important things you learn are things that, I as a student or many of us as students brushed over, which was LPO type terms or the buzzwords that we were throwing around psychological safety, collaboration, expectations management. That seems so obvious to us when we were students, but when you come out to the real world, a lot of us take some really hard beatings and learn lessons over because we have to learn the hard way how to collaborate and have all this accountability. Um, which is why, again, I was thankful for the job that I had to come out of school in. But what I think was really great about IB business programs in general are truly the soft skills that you gain, and your capacity to just grind as a young 20 something year old, to learn the value of a grinding experience where in our program, and I know translated to NBA, it's similar. We have, for example, these 48-hour reports where we're given a business problem, a case, and you're put into groups and you have 40 hours to solve it. And of course, a lot of times you're not sleeping and it sounds daunting from the start, and then you realize how much you can actually achieve in that time. I think was very, very great. And then beyond that, being able to communicate, um, I would like to think that without Ivy, let's say I somehow managed to make it into consulting after school without having done Ivy, I would have failed right away because I would not have been able to communicate properly or to be able to even work with people.
Okay. So, I mean, sounds like there actually were some very significant positives, right? On the skill set side. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, the shall we say distaste for the rat race competitive aspect of how that the way it funnels all of you guys, right? Because and we haven't chatted about this at all yet. I mean, I did not ask you, I think already because I knew the answer about how much Ivy helped you as someone who came in and didn't necessarily know exactly what he wanted to do. How much did Ivy help you figure that out? Right. I'll just leave it as a question because I think I'm assuming the answer without actually asking you.
Uh, if you're thinking that Ivy made me more confused than ever across my entire career path, then yes. As an example, when I first arrived to university, those 2 years before doing IB, there was a pre-business class in our first year that I enjoyed very thoroughly, and that was actually one of the paths coming out of IB that you could actually teach one of these classes for 2 years, and kind of contribute back to the community. And I thought that was a really great path before going into IB. But yet, because of the rat race and the push for prestige, which we've talked around the topic, but in my mind, prestige was the number one thing that I personally chased, and is a big theme of what we brought out of the program. Pushed me away from doing this because, of course, it wasn't a prestige opportunity. It wasn't within one of those four verticals that we thought was the be all end all. And even, using another example, of course, the world of work has changed a lot, but at the time, entrepreneurship was also an option coming out of Ivy. But myself, at least, and I know at least a few others, looked down on that path again because it wasn't on that prestigious road. And I had connections from my classmates who went into entrepreneurship, and we thought, oh, what a stupid path at the time. And now they're extremely successful. And that was actually the path they wanted to go on from the start. And they actually got what they wanted out of the program versus myself. I was fed that this is life, and go get it. So in many ways, Ivy has made me start to weigh my investment against the outcomes, and the prestige of the next step that I'm choosing to take, and what value it means to my brand or my resume, let's say, when I try and tell the story of why I'm here today.
Yeah, yeah. This all. I mean, I wrote a book about this, right? About my dislike for this aspect of it. The whole point of an education system is to actually help people kind of find their path and presumably, whatever the intermediate goal is, the end goal being happier, right? Being the end result. Um, I think we've done probably a horrible job of that, to be quite honest, right? In B school in particular, I think, right? I won't speak for the entire university, though I have a terrible feeling it's probably not that much better outside of B school. Um, and it's, I didn't actually have this idea fully consciously formed when I taught you, Dave, because I was just starting it out and I was trying to figure out the job and just how to survive and all that good stuff. But just seeing the pattern play out over and over again. And every time I do one of these podcast interviews, it basically gets reinforced, right? I'm actually waiting for the podcast interview with the student where because obviously I never know what you guys are going to say. Well, they'll say, no, actually everything was great all the way through. I have no reservations about how any of it played out, and I think it's exactly the way it should be. And there is no one who has said that yet, right? And that might be selection bias from my podcast, or might actually be a reflection of how it actually works, which I think is really what the problem is.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts to what you just shared. First of all, on your book, shamefully, of course, until we reconnected, I didn't know you wrote a book. But shamelessly, I will plug that because I listen to all my books because personal vice of mine, I can't be bothered to hold a book. I saw that there was an audiobook version of this, so I have downloaded it. So I will definitely listen to that. So that's my plug number one.
Oh, thank
Number
you.
two, I think that university is a business, especially in North America, right? They're privately funded, and I can only I've heard and I can only imagine, for example, even outside of business, the trials and tribulations that you, for example, went through as an associate professor or lecturer coming in, and having to navigate those politics. I unfortunately think that the challenges that I'm sharing, you've faced, they extend to almost all spheres of work. and that I am very put off, and this is a very, present day way of thinking is, you know, um, I want to find something I'm so passionate about that I'm going to be excited every day to come in and invest into it. Um, and that's, I think that my running hypothesis now that I'm further along in the world of startups, and I'm seeing more of them, and I'm seeing the way that they're evolving, where they're more formulaic now. Startups to the millennial generation are very much my analogy of working in a bank or the government for our parents, where the stability is was paramount in being able to accumulate wealth. Startup is this millennial dream of you get to own what you're doing. And you get that line of sight, and there's a bag of gold at the end as well for it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No worries about the book, by the way, Dave. So if you, I mean, you didn't know about it, neither did essentially the rest of the world, right? So that's okay. That's something that. So Dave, later, if you ever end up writing a book, which I think everybody thinks about doing that at some point in their life, right? You will later. Something will come to your mind, something will happen in your life, and someone will say to you, "Hey, you should write a book," and you will actually think about it for at least a half second. It's a super painful thing to do, as rewarding as it is at the end. And then I remember when I published it, I was like, wait a second. Like nobody knows that I've done this. Like nobody knows that and then so now there's been kind of like, all right, so how do I let people know that it's out there? The right people, right? The people who would actually find it kind of meaningful. Yeah, so thanks. But in terms of, I think you've hit on a few things here. So one is there is a generational difference at play, which is part of the reason why I actually wrote the book, because what I see, let me try to kind of tell you my perspective on a lot of the things that you're talking about. You said you don't have to give advice to young people anymore to quit their job because they're doing it anyway, right? And I observed the same thing. There is way less conformity, way less tolerance for things that don't align. I think all of that is great, right? I think that is because it directly kind of goes against what the system is trying to push students to do that wouldn't necessarily be in their interest. So this is all plus points, right? Where I think it's potentially challenging is just because you rebel, it doesn't mean you know what you're supposed to do. And what I'm seeing is evidence of rebellion, not just in a micro context, but like globally, when I look at statistics, for example, right, across countries. So this isn't even isolated to any one country. I see plenty of evidence of rebellion, not tremendous evidence that people are ending up in better places, mostly because they don't know what to do about their problem other than rebel, right? Like quit, but then at some point they got to show up and they don't know what to do, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a personal fear of mine as well, soulfully, that it's a lot of bravery to be able to walk away, but not a lot of thought around the delayed gratification that, of course, let's say my generation or generations prior had the opposite fault of delaying too much. So in terms of the workforce and I don't know, advancing the way we work, if let's say this generation and the next generation they continue to push themselves out of work, well, who's going to be running the world at a minimum? Yeah. And to give you an example here as well, around the importance of university and how university is a business. During that period where I was doing some freelancing, I consulted this education technology company who created this. Essentially, it's a summer accelerator for high school students, for like very high performing high school students. And I got to meet some of these youth. I was trying not to say kids, and they're brilliant, and they're very thoughtful, very ambitious, but almost all of them universally, at least in this select sample of, let's say, 100 students, they don't want to go to university. They don't see the ROI, the value in it. They think I can just kind of do my own thing and I can have fun, whatever it is. But there is value to, again, going back to the value of Ivy and of school, developing those social skills, those soft skills, the ability to grit through and at least recognize or try to push through these problems. Um, because I do, and perhaps this is my millennial brain, out of touch millennial brain speaking, that it does promote growth in those situations.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I think a university at the moment offers kind of a mix of positives and negatives. Um, I can actually very much sympathize, though, with people who are substantially younger than even you, Dave, and looking at the circumstance and like, why would I? And they look at the outcomes, right, of graduation, and I can understand why they may not find those compelling, right? Particularly when there's many role models now of people who either dropped out of that system and did great, or never even bothered going down that system and they're doing great, right? Like and to be fair, I think universities have not done a good job to adapt. We're probably some of the most least adaptable institutions in the entire society, right? Like companies will adapt more, at least in crisis. But healthcare, we compete with healthcare on lack of adaptation, right? Like we'll see who doesn't move, right? Kind of, or moves the slowest, and we're kind of there. So, I'm completely in agreement with what you're saying. It is changing. It's changing slowly, ever so slowly. But I think I've said this a few times in previous episodes. As a faculty member, when we sit in faculty meetings, and Ivey is a place, by the way, where the faculty, by and large, really do care about the students. This subject matter never comes up. Everything we've just talked about is a zero, right?
Right.
So it's not, part of it might be because the incentive isn't there. I think for some people, that's how they think of it as a business. And you're like, what's wrong with this person getting a banking job? Like, why would that be considered something that we've done wrong, right? I think would be one camp that would argue, right? But it's funny, I'm just imagining this because we don't even bring it up. It's not even in the awareness. And I think there's another that just doesn't even have a concept of how we would change things to try to address what we're talking about. And as a result, there's no appetite to change unless literally a whole generation's like, why would I go to you guys when I could just not do that, right? And then we're going to have that meeting. But then it's going to be motivated by how do we get these guys to show up? And so we'll be very reactive about that, right? I have seen no evidence, or virtually no evidence, anywhere in North America across any level of tier of university that they are actually going after this problem in a real way.
Yeah, and I think by extension of that too, relating this back to the Ivy experience, it's meant to mirror an MBA experience where I do think that myself at that time didn't have the maturity to really appreciate the content and the opportunities that were being provided to me. That, I think a lot of us speak now, if we went back to school, we would take it seriously because we see the one for one investment in that. My feedback potentially is that, especially as a 2-year program where, especially the recruitment aspect of it happens only half a year in out of those 2 years about learning about business for the very first time for a lot of folks, it's too early. That would be my feedback is, well, you get a banking job. What does that mean for you? Why do I want a banking job? Or why does that align to the value of why I've come to Ivy in the first place? And besides the money or the prestige, that could matter to some people. And I do think that at some point you will have a guest that comes in and says, hey, Ivy made me who I am. I had some wonderful experiences in there. There were minor flaws, but on the spectrum, it was hugely positive. But I think for the majority of us, the lack of maturity and the lack of preparation to share the not the rose tinted glasses version of what you're being exposed to is a massive gap of what universities do, because at the end of the day, they're trying to get enrollment and business.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's really true. It's really true. One of the things that I like about our whole discussion is, I think for anyone who's listening, so I'm imagining right now an Ivey HBA or maybe even MBA, but particularly an HBA, who might be 2 or 3 years out, right, from graduation, exactly where you were before, who might have a lot in common with you, actually, even though they've never met you, and just doesn't know what to do, right? And I think if there was a conversation about, well, hey, maybe you could go to Mexico and just see how you like it, which is kind of what you did, right? It was pandemic inspired, shall we say. But But that was the beginning of a road that I think some people in that situation before that moment would be terrified of the downside of what could go wrong, right? Um, maybe I'll be homeless, right? Maybe I'll at least fall off the track, right? I won't be in the rat race, trying to win anymore, right? And what I love about your story is that you've clearly, and yours is one where it wasn't even, correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't sound like it was methodical planning that took you to your, like you kind of just, things happen, you kind of you met people you
Yeah.
liked, and so you went with that, right? Which led you, it sounds like, to more people you liked and even a potential romantic partner, right? Like these are all kind of things that were showing up for you on this path, but none of which would have been predictable beforehand, particularly if you only knew what you knew living in Toronto, right? Like this is a life that you couldn't have imagined potentially. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you painted the picture in a very nice way. I do think, yes, there's a lot of organized chaos happening, but I also would, first of all, challenge the lack of choices, I think, especially generationally different priorities that folks are making post school, let's say. So maybe going to Mexico doesn't seem so far-fetched as it used to, or going anywhere else for that matter. But also, I feel as though the challenge, and I will articulate this with an example after this, is the pressure that you're under to make a decision that's not going to create more pain for you in your life. Where, I came out of school X amount of dollars in debt because, again, I funded my own education. But as a result of that pressure, the conversations that we were having back then, Brian, which is going to be my example, was, oh my God, there's only X number of jobs and I'm not getting them, but yet I feel like I'm smart enough to get them. Why? What are these people doing that I'm not doing? How can I perform? How can I create more opportunities? Um, what do I need on my resume? And again, the theme of our conversation now is a lot different because I no longer have those pressures. But if, let's say, I'm coming from a place of scarcity where, I don't know, I'm in a ton of debt, or I have been working for a long time, or, several other pressures are coming in, this might be a lot different, or what I may need in this time may be a lot different. And I can empathize a lot with students. And I'm hoping what I just articulated as an example as well is perhaps what HBA students are going through right now, so that they don't just look at me and say, hey, I can just give up on this and go to Mexico, but that perhaps in some kind of cheesy way, it's like you're struggling now, but even this person who's talking now, who went through these sort of similar struggles, is relatable and still came out on the other side alive at the very least.
Oh, more than alive, right, Dave? I mean, so let's check off the box on what you've accomplished here, right? Just to be clear, because I know we chatted for a while. Um, you had an issue with alignment on on an internal kind of, almost even soul level, probably, right? Even though we don't use that type of terminology. There was something inside you that just wasn't lining up with what was going on in the outside and what you thought you had to be doing. And when you're younger and in those environments, of course, it's natural when there's no voice advocating for you, because nobody ironically tells you that you need to advocate for you. Nobody says that, right? So it's quite natural that you learn that you need to conform, right? And then you get rewarded
Yep.
for that. And that's what everything tells you, right? The incentive system tells you that. So what's beautiful about your story is that is not how no matter what happens next day, this is not how your story is going to go for the rest of your life. And you've
Yep.
essentially passed that. There are other people who make it 20 or 30 years past your age who just never pass that point. Like they don't, right? And yes, there's the category there were super practical concerns. I think this tends to describe my parents' generation, maybe your parents' generation more accurately than ours. So yes, of
Yep.
course, there are life circumstances that will necessitate that, but that's not usually the circumstance I see, right, from my students. It's not like, yeah, you really don't have options. It's more like you have this incredible fear because you don't know what else is out there, and you feel trapped and you don't know what to do, and you feel like you're alone and all this kind of stuff. That's by far the dominant kind of thing, right? And what ironically your story proves is that, yeah, you don't even need a plan sometimes. What you need to do is to make a decision, right? And then trust to some degree that you're going to figure it, and just be open about it, right? When you went to Mexico, you didn't know this was how it was going to unfold. But one could argue this whole path was waiting for you the moment you decided to get on that plane from Mexico, right? One could make that argument.
Yeah, I like to live as though I have this internal locus of control. So I like to think, albeit chaotic, these decisions were still ones that I made in the moment, or rather than, hey, this was always predestined that I would always end up, let's say, outside of Canada or outside of the original corporate path that was set on me. But I think it's very fair. I also think as though my belief is that life is a bit of a sitcom and there's always going to be challenges, and these soul belonging challenges will always exist. And for the practical aspect of it, we can either choose to quiet them down or to actually take action on them. And maybe on the next challenge I will just take the practical route. Who knows?
Maybe,
And I
but
think
you
that's
haven't
that's the
yet, though,
beauty of
Dave.
it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Dave, but you haven't yet, right? That's not your story. You actually took action more than once, right? Your first attempt, right, got derailed, right, by the world in some sense, and then you tried again, and that's led you down yet another path. But what I love about this story, right, particularly for anyone who's listening, who's in the circumstance of you maybe 10 plus years ago, is like this story is not one that has a terrible tragic ending where it validates that going off the beaten path is effectively some form of suicide, right? Or some ending of the world, right? Or at least one's world. Like none of this is true, actually, right?
Right. And I think the world is shaped by those who go off the beaten path. So there is definitely a lot of truth to that.
Yeah, yeah. And so in that sense, I really appreciate that you were willing to kind of share your story so openly here, and that we get to catch up again, Dave. For everyone who is listening right now, is there anything else that you kind of feel like you want to say as a message, maybe to younger versions of yourself or people who are coming out? I have no doubt that Ivy is not talking about any of this. So you probably have a bunch of people in Toronto, or we can imagine many people who are kind of disillusioned in their mid-20s, wondering what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I will lean back into the health angle here as I'm trying to thoughtfully answer your question here, and answer in a way that apparently is in Gen Z lingo, which is go touch grass, go outside, um, invest in your well-being now, because, for example, your aging, your bad habits don't show up for the next 10 years. But if you want to be able to enjoy your life in 10 years, 20 years, whatever you may have, you invest in yourself, move, connect with yourself, and perhaps reflect in case you need to make some difficult choices in your life. That's uh that's my attempt at being wise.